Well, here we are in downtown Seattle where so much history has happened, and we're outside the Rainier Club where so much of that history has transpired since 1888.
Well, it's nice because we're celebrating the 150th year of Edward Curtis's birth, and this is the place he spent a lot of his time, and we'll go through the hallowed halls and see exactly where he used to live. Edward Curtis is arguably Seattle's most famous artist, and certainly one of the most famous members at the Rainier Club. The Rainier Club is very important in Seattle's history as well as the Curtis story, and the club has a wonderful Curtis collection.
Edward Curtis gave his club and our community so much. It's a gift that 100 years later is still giving. We're constantly reminded of his contribution because it adorns our walls.
There is so much Curtis, so many Curtis treasures in this place, and that's why I tell people that the Rainier Club, by default, is arguably the world's greatest Curtis museum.
So Bob, here we have essentially 5 pictures about the club, and so the first home was a mansion rented from James McNaught where the Seattle Public Library now stands. When Curtis joined the club in 1903, the club was 15 years old. The founders of the club established this private club just 2 blocks from here where the Seattle Public Library is, just so it had boarding and dining spaces in what was territorial Washington. And it changed its home over time. It moved to the Seattle Theater in 1893. It was there that Mark Twain spoke to the membership, and it was in this building that the Hermon Expedition had dinner before it went off on its scientific expedition, which has ties to Curtis. And in our guest registers from days gone by, we've recorded the signatures of John Burroughs, John Muir, Henry Gannett, and E.H. Hermon before they left for the Hermon Expedition, which was one of the richest scientific expeditions in history at that time.
E.H. Hermon was a famous railroad man who, for vacation, decided to take a little trip to Alaska and invited along 80 well-known scientists to join him, with Curtis going along as the photographer. So they were going up to identify all the flora and fauna and people of the great state of Alaska. And Curtis learned many things on the Hermon Expedition. He learned about ethnography, and he learned about wax cylinder recordings, because Hermon had wax cylinder recorders there to entertain his grandchildren during the trip. But Curtis thought, aha, I can use those to record Native Americans. And he later did thousands of recordings to document the tribes. He also learned something he didn't want to do. When he saw these explorers taking things from Indian villages, totem poles, carvings, for the museums, without permission of the tribes, and he decided he never wanted to do that and would capture them instead in photographs, and respected them and would even pay them to take their pictures. So he learned from the Hermon Expedition so many things and applied those to his entire project. After the Hermon Expedition, Curtis was famous enough in Seattle that he was invited to be a member of the Rainier Club.
Edward Curtis joined the club in 1903. The club purchased the land where we're standing right now in 1903 to construct this Kirk and Cutter building in 1904. This was the entrance to the club at that period of time. And then just 26 days before the stock market crashed, we completed the largest addition in the club's history, where we added on additional ballrooms and bedrooms. So that's how our clubhouse came to be until its current day. We're headed to the Rainier Room, which as we go from the 1929 addition into the 1904 original clubhouse, the Rainier Room houses a fireplace, this was the lobby to the Rainier Club before the addition. And it's really a focal point to the club. We even cook in it. Wish I know what stories Curtis could tell about this fireplace.
A lot. And he may have given his talks in this very room. So.
Yes. I think Curtis decided to become a member of the Rainier Club because his portrait business was so successful, not with just members of the Rainier Club, but members of the Sunset Club. It was really the Seattle community. These were people that admired him, and he was invited to membership. So, you know, here we have past presidents of the Rainier Club, and so one of our early past presidents was Thomas Burke, and here's a photograph that Curtis took of Judge Burke. Curtis would take these photographs, and the members would sign them. So one photograph that will be familiar with many Seattleites is Bill Boeing. If I turn the page, you'll see J.W. Kleiss, who, along with Edward Curtis and Colonel Blethyn, formed a portion of the Arts Committee for the Alaska-Yukon Pacific Exposition.
Well, here he is. And he's next to his image of Teddy Roosevelt. And of all the images taken of Teddy, it's my understanding that Teddy liked this one the best. And Teddy Roosevelt was an important part of the Curtis story. And it started when Curtis's wife, Clara, noticed an ad in the Ladies' Home Journal for a contest for the most beautiful child. And Edward Curtis photographed a local girl here in Seattle, submitted that, and won first prize. Teddy Roosevelt recognized this and wanted to know more about Curtis and invited him out to Sagamore Hill, Teddy's summer home, to take photographs of his children. Teddy then later invited him to come back for his 1905 inauguration, where he was able to photograph Geronimo, who had been invited to Teddy's inauguration. And finally, Teddy wrote both the introduction to Edward Curtis's 20-volume and portfolio set of the North American Indian, and also introduced him to J.P. Morgan to help Curtis fund his project. Edward Curtis's job was to run his studio in Seattle, but he kept getting sidetracked and drawn in by the Native Americans who fascinated him. He was inspired, and it changed his whole life. He decided that he would do this huge project to document all of the tribes west of the Mississippi, from Mexico to Alaska, by photographing them, but also documenting their language, their religion, their culture, their arts, their crafts, their medicine men, their dances, everything he could possibly learn. Like an encyclopedia sometimes said, the biggest project since the St. James Bible. So it was a huge, huge project that all of a sudden took over his entire life. He was extremely dedicated to the point of destroying his family, his finances, his everything because of his dedication. And the Rainier Club played a big part throughout the time of his whole project. So he spent time here when he happened to be in town. And then as things got rougher with his relationship with Clara, his wife, and by 1916, when she filed for divorce, whenever he wasn't working, he would stay at the Rainier Club through the divorce of 1919.
I can't tell you what room Edward Curtis was a resident in when he was boarding in between his trips, but here's one of our overnight rooms today, and it's nice accommodations. And of course, in those days, there was 24/7 cooking and porters and everything that went with the service that you would expect in a fine club.
Nice.
They were very good to him. During his divorce, he spent a lot of time here upstairs. And in a lot of his correspondence, he would say, "I'll be where I always am, at the Rainier Club. You can find me there." Why does this place have so many fabulous pictures, including some of the premier masterpieces? It's how he paid his rent. He had nothing. So he would give them his pictures as a way to continue staying here. And he also took some pictures of club members as well.
You know, we really don't know a lot about that time, but we do know through our minutes books and other recordings that Mr. Curtis ran out of money, and the way someone figured out how to pay the bill was through the donation of original signed platinum prints that now adorn the stairwells and the hallways. We all get to enjoy 100 years later every day.
You know, you just walk down the hallways here and they're just all over the place. So you turn any corner, any room, and you'll run into Edward Curtis's, you know, classic, magnificent images.
Yeah, beautiful images.
What's different about the collection at the Rainier Club is they were hand-selected by Curtis, hand-framed by Curtis, and our platinum prints, which are the best of the paper prints, and come in very large sizes, which are rare for Curtis images. And so here we see 4 natives on horses coming out from behind the rocks, and the light shining down on them, and a classical image, and one of the best ones of Curtis, and also a large image, larger than you'll see in most places, with a classic Curtis frame. So Out of the Darkness, I think, is one of his most important images because it shows hope, and fortunately that hope has come true, and the tribes are reviving and becoming stronger than ever, and their voices are being heard more than ever. Over time, the Rainier Club has invited Curtis's descendants back to the Rainier Club, and Edward Curtis had 4 children. Beth, who worked a lot with him in the studio, Hal, the eldest son, Florence, the second daughter, and Catherine, also known as Billy, and only Florence went on to have children from that whole group.
In 1983, the club held an event with the children of Edward Curtis, and we invited both Hal and Florence to speak. This was the first time where the club actually baked salmon in the fireplace on the second floor in the Rainier Room, and we invited the Native Americans from Blake Island to come over and perform that ceremony. And one of the highlights I heard about is that Florence spoke of many things that evening about her father, but what lives in my memory is that famous Canyon de Chelly photograph where she talked about being in the covered wagon while her father shot that scene as they went across the canyon. It's just something I never forget every day I come to work.
In 2018, the great-grandchildren of Edward Curtis arrived in Seattle, and they came here because they knew of all the activities that were going on, and I invited them to stay at the Rainier Club. We are so excited to have the Curtis family back in Seattle. How's that? Such a great thing. And John?
Bob
Winquist.
Pleasure to meet you.
Really
Bob.
great to meet
Grable.
you. I'm just so excited, and I think we're going to have so
You're
much
excited.
fun.
Yes, without a doubt.
I am John Edward Grable. I'm a professional photographer, member of the Professional Photographers of America, and Edward Curtis is my great-grandfather. For me and for my 2 sisters and my wife, we've always dreamt about visiting where Curtis' studio was, where he lived, where he worked. This year was significant as it would have been my great-grandfather's 150th birth year.
Welcome to the Rainier Club. It's an honor to have you with us. Well, thank you. It's an honor to be here.
So we decided to visit the Seattle area, and there was many places that we were going to visit while we were here that we were very excited to see. And the Rainier Club has been amazing. They welcomed us with open arms, and it was very special for me knowing that my great-grandfather actually lived here for 3+ years. They graciously put us up for 2 nights, and although we don't know what room exactly Curtis used, we stayed in a beautiful room. Could have been where Curtis stayed. I like to think it was, but yeah, it was quite the experience to be here. So after our first night, we gathered in the breakfast room, and Michael Troyer brings in an audio tape.
In 1983, your grandmother, Florence Curtis Graybill, was here, along with brother Hal, her brother Hal, Curtis's son. And the Rainier Club has a recording of that. So this is
amazing.
This is Florence speaking at the Rainier Club in 1983 at the Salmon Bake. It's just magnificent.
And we went into the redwood trees. And it wasn't just a casual, I had to learn all about the redwood trees. And he had told me once on this trip, he said, Florence, you kind of look at things, but you don't observe them enough.
I love that.
Then I realized he was fundamentally a scientist. He knew that to write for the North American Indian, and it had to be correct. And to do that, for instance, the religious ceremonies of the Indians, he had to participate in that ceremony, if it was possible, in order to write about it and be correct.
It was such a delight to hear my grandmother's voice after all these years played back on this tape. It gave me goosebumps. It was quite the treat. During my second evening stay here at the Rainier Club, Preston Singletary was the guest speaker. He is a renowned Native American artist, specializes in glasswork. His art is amazing and beautiful. And after his talk, we had a wonderful dinner with Preston and many of the other members of the club that had worked on this celebration of the 150th birth year of my great-grandfather. During this dinner, we noticed that there was an empty chair at the table, and somebody suggested that the empty place setting was in remembrance of our great-grandfather, and that at least in spirit he was there with us that evening.
It was a wonderful visit, and while the Graybills were here, they were able to tour the club, toured Seattle Art Museum, toured the university special collections, and it led to going throughout the Northwest, traveling with them to the original Curtis house built in 1887, to Port Orchard to visit with Mary Lou Slaughter, the great-great-great-granddaughter of Princess Angeline, who was the first Native American that Curtis photographed. And it was just one of the highlights of the whole year. For the 150th anniversary of Edward Curtis's birth, the Rainier Club decided to do a whole series of events throughout the year, and they named it Edward Curtis Native Voices. We opened with a gallery exhibit focused around Curtis's glass lantern slides. So they would take the photograph, they would put it on the slide, and they then would hand color these slides. This is a magic lantern projector, which is how they would project the slides. And Curtis went around the nation giving these talks and filled Carnegie Hall with however many thousand people, Carnegie Hall, and mesmerized them with standing ovation when he made this show. It was decided to enlarge these glass-colored lantern slides of Edward Curtis that came through the family and hadn't been seen for 100 years, and put them on canvas. There were concerns that they would be blurry, and they were enlarged to 8 by 10, which were perfectly clear, and on up to 3 feet by 4 feet, and they remained clear, which really heralded the magnificent work that Curtis did with large format photographs. So, here's the camera. As part of the gallery lecture, I brought along Curtis's original camera. And he had many cameras, but this is documented as his camera that he used the most, which is a 6.5 by 8.5 Century camera built in 1902 that put out some pretty amazing pictures.
Please help me welcome Tim Egan.
Another event was a presentation by Tim Egan, the famous Seattleite, maybe best known for his regular editorials in the New York Times, and wrote a book called Short Nights of the Shadow Catcher. And although there are many books written about Curtis, Tim Egan's is the one that's been read by more people than any other.
And I'm going to talk about the man and his masterpiece. And this is a masterpiece. This is arguably the greatest photographic achievement of all time. Not the greatest American photographic achievement, but the greatest photographic achievement of all time.
Another one of the events held here at the Rainier Club was the Salmon Bake. It was salmon cooking on the fire in traditional native fashion, Pendleton blankets on stands all around the room, which made for a wonderful background. Dancers, that Hattie Kaufman, one of the committee members at the Rainier Club, and she's from the Nez Perce tribe, and she brought her friends in who were dancing and just made the whole event special. As part of the event, there was a children's corner where they were busy coloring the Native American drawing motifs, which were then placed up on the columns in the Rainier Room to convert them to wonderful totem poles during the Salmon Bake.
You know, this building was the biggest building on this hill at one time. There was another building.
Jim Thomas was the guest speaker, who is a Tlingit chief, and he gave a wonderful talk.
And now it is surrounded by skyscrapers. And yet when you say, Jim Thomas, you're speaking at the Rainier Club, oh, that's big. And that's the way this club stands in the minds of the people of Seattle. Congratulations to you.
So in my own language, my name would be Yustobs.
Ken Workman, the great-great-great-great-grandson of Chief Seattle, spoke twice at the Rainier Club and informed everyone of the Duwamish tribe and their work to get federal recognition.
It's good to see you here on this land of the Duwamish and in this big house at the Duwabs at the Heko at the Yayanapali, in this big house where the ancient ones continue to live.
We had another event focused around the film that Edward Curtis made in 1914. He went up to the north end of Vancouver Island, where he filmed the first full-length feature film with Native American actors, and it was called In the Land of the Headhunters. The film opened with tremendous response, but went broke because of an argument with the producer, and that movie disappeared for about 70 years. But Bill Holm from the Burke Museum would hear about this film and kept asking where it was. And he searched and searched and searched, and all of a sudden found it at the Field Museum in Chicago, in the basement.
And I asked him my standard question, and he said, after a pause, "We have a copy."
And he retrieved the footage and resurrected the film.
It's a real pleasure to be back out in Seattle once again to talk about the Edward Curtis movie.
We had a guest speaker, Brad Evans from Rutgers University, who's written a wonderful book on Land of the Headhunters. We also had Bill Holm present, who was able to speak to the audience about his finding of the film in the first place and regenerating the interest. There were many events around the Great Northwest to recognize Edward Curtis's 150th anniversary of his birth. And the Rainier Club reached out to the community and shared their wonderful collection to other venues. And they were sent to Seattle Art Museum for their exhibit on double exposure, which ran throughout the summer. And then the colored photographs from Curtis's lantern slides went on to the Washington State Convention Center in the fall, where they'll remain until January of next year.
You know, the Rainier Club is very proud to have this Curtis collection as part of its art collection and to be able to share it with people in the city.
Well, the city should be proud because Curtis came here at age 19, became a famous photographer, and did this entire work with his studio just up the street on 4th Avenue. And
as a result of all this focus on the 150th birthday of Curtis, it's really my hope that the dialogue that all of us have with the Native Americans continues to improve our existence here in North America. Like with any milestone, hopefully this continues to keep dialogue going that just makes us a better, larger community together.
Muckleshoot, Lakota, Nez Perce, all here and all celebrating.
In looking back at the year of recognizing Curtis's work, and the Native Voice is a part of this, the Rainier Club just had a tremendous time and a lot of fun. I think it's important for people to recognize Curtis as a famous Seattleite and all the work that he did in, around, and for Seattle, and the work that he did to really try to identify and tell us about Native Americans. And it's an important lesson because the Native Americans have many things to teach us, and a lot of it has to do with preserving this earth and respecting the earth and respecting everything about it, the water, the trees, the animals. And if we can't learn that lesson, we may be the vanishing race.